I'm a federal wildlife agent, though I didn't always know that would be my path. Growing up, I was always drawn to nature, the way the woods smelled after a rain, the way animals moved through the brush like shadows. But I never knew the full weight of that connection until I started rescuing animals. Now, I work with law enforcement to protect wildlife, handle rescue operations, and ensure that the law is upheld when it comes to the treatment of animals. It's a job that's not just a career for me, it's a calling. A few years ago, after a tough patch in my life, I found myself drawn to something I never expected: horses. My heart had been broken, and I didn't think it would ever heal. But when I came across 2 rescue horses, I knew I had to give them a home. They weren't just animals to me. They were a new beginning, a way to find peace again. They weren't perfect, but neither was I. We healed together, and their loyalty and strength became my own. They became my family, my anchor in a world that felt like it was falling apart. The neighborhood I moved to was everything I thought I wanted: a peaceful suburban enclave with tree-lined streets and quiet, well-kept lawns. The houses were all charming, the kind of place where families could raise kids and feel safe. But something about it always felt just a little off, like the perfectly manicured lawns were hiding something. There was an unspoken rule here that everyone had to be the same, follow the same expectations, and look the same. Behind the white picket fences and freshly painted doors, control lurked, and the HOA was its iron fist. Karen, the HOA president, embodied that control in the most suffocating way. I'd only met her a handful of times, but that was enough to know what kind of person she was. Tall, impeccably dressed, and always with a stern expression, like she was judging every aspect of your life. She was one of those people who believed the rules existed to be enforced, no matter how small or ridiculous the issue. She had a way of making every conversation feel like a lecture, as if she were some kind of neighborhood queen above everyone else. At first, it was just little things. I'd get a note in the mailbox about how my garden needed to be trimmed to the HOA standard, or how my trash cans weren't properly hidden. Trivial issues, sure, but Karen always made it clear that she was watching, and she didn't hesitate to let me know when I was stepping out of line. Her obsession with order, though, was becoming hard to ignore. I started to realize she didn't just want a beautiful neighborhood. She wanted control over everything, and soon enough she'd set her sights on me. When I brought the horses home, I felt a sense of relief. There they were, Luna, the sweet, gentle mare, and Diesel, the spunky gelding with a personality as big as his frame. They were mine now, and their presence gave me a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I set up a large pen for them in the backyard, not too close to the neighbors' homes, but enough to give them space to roam. I worked late into the night getting their stable just right, every post and rail positioned with care, every detail perfect. The first few days, everything was fine. The neighbors waved as they passed. A few even stopped by to admire the horses. It felt like the start of something good, until Karen noticed. She showed up on my doorstep one morning, a frown etched deep on her face. Without so much as a greeting, she launched into a lecture about the horses being a nuisance to the neighborhood. "They're unsightly," she insisted, pointing to the horses grazing quietly in the pen. "They're against HOA guidelines even if they aren't explicitly banned. I'll have to report this if you don't take care of it." I tried to keep my cool, explaining that the HOA rules didn't say anything about horses. They were just animals after all. But Karen wasn't having it. She wouldn't listen to reason, her tone dripping with authority, as if she were the sole keeper of the neighborhood's standards. She made it clear that I'd better get rid of them. Or else. I stood my ground, refusing to back down. The horses weren't going anywhere. That was my home, and I wasn't about to let her bully me into submission. I could feel the tension building already. This was just the beginning. At first, Karen's complaints were just an inconvenience. An occasional note slipped under my door, or a curt conversation where she insisted the horses didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But over time, things escalated. She started making vague references to complaints from other neighbors. Of course, none of these neighbors ever showed their faces, and when I asked for specifics, Karen just waved me off with a smug smile, claiming the HOA had received multiple concerns about the horses. But when I spoke with a few of the other residents, they seemed genuinely confused. No one had said a word to me directly. It was starting to feel like Karen was pulling complaints out of thin air, using the HOA rules as her weapon to bully me into submission. Then things began to get weird, really weird. One morning I walked out to check on the horses and found a section of the fence had been cut, the wire twisted and torn like someone had intentionally damaged it. I immediately thought of Karen, but there was no way to prove it. I fixed the fence thinking maybe it was just a freak accident or the work of some wild animal. But then it happened again. Another part of the fence was damaged. This time the gate was left ajar and I found a few hoof prints that didn't belong to my horses. Small, deliberate, almost as if someone had been trying to lure them out. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The damage wasn't extreme, just enough to make things feel off, like someone was testing the boundaries, pushing me to react. Still, I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe it was just wear and tear from a harsh storm, or the random mischief of kids. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. Someone was targeting my horses. I couldn't prove it yet, but my suspicion was growing, and every day I felt like I was one step away from uncovering the truth. It was like someone was playing a sick game with me, and I was starting to lose patience. It was still dark when I woke up that morning, the kind of early morning darkness that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, thick with the promise of the day yet to come. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air biting at my skin. My heart had been heavy all week, the tension with Karen gnawing at the back of my mind. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. I stepped into the backyard. The familiar scent of the horses' hay and the soft rustling of their hooves usually comforting. But today, everything felt wrong, too quiet. I could sense it in the air. Something was off. My heart began to race as I walked toward the stable. And then I saw it. The first thing I noticed was Luna. She was lying in the center of the pen, her body unnaturally still. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. I walked closer, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Diesel, too, was sprawled next to her, motionless. They were dead. I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe they were just sleeping. That maybe I'd misunderstood. But the sight of their vacant eyes and the unnatural position of their limbs told me everything I needed to know. They had been killed. There was no question about it. This wasn't some tragic accident. This was intentional, deliberate. The rage that coursed through me was nothing like I'd ever felt before. It wasn't the grief I'd expected. It was something sharper, colder. I crouched beside them, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch Luna's neck. Cold. Her once silky coat was matted with blood. Diesel's body was just as still, and I felt a pang of guilt, as though I should have done something to protect them, even though I knew I was powerless to stop whatever had happened. But there was no time to dwell on that now. I had to focus. I quickly scanned the area, desperate for any clue that could explain how this had happened. The fence was still intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no marks on the ground that could indicate an animal had attacked. It was almost as though they'd been carefully placed in the center of the pen, their deaths meant to make a statement. My first thought was Karen. I could feel the bile rise in my throat as I considered the possibility. She'd been the one to constantly push against me, to make my life miserable over something as ridiculous as horses in the backyard. I thought of all the little things that had happened recently. The damaged fence, the odd sense of being watched. I had to admit it to myself. This wasn't a coincidence, but I had no proof, no evidence. Just a gut feeling, a sickening certainty that Karen had gone too far. I felt my stomach twist with the weight of it. This was more than just a petty vendetta. This was murder, and it was personal. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the bodies of the horses I had saved, the animals that had brought me so much peace and healing. The pain was unbearable. But somewhere underneath it all, I felt a cold resolve start to form. Karen had made a dangerous mistake, and now I would make her pay. I couldn't take it anymore. The grief, the rage, the betrayal, it was all bubbling over. I had to confront her. I couldn't let this go without a fight. So without thinking it through, I stormed over to Karen's house. It was still early, but I didn't care. I pounded on her door with force, barely giving her a chance to answer before I barged in. The moment she saw me, I could tell she already knew. The look on her face said everything. She was expecting this. "You did it," I spat, my voice trembling with anger. "You killed my horses." Karen stood there, her expression unreadable for a moment before it twisted into that all-too-familiar smugness. She folded her arms over her chest, looking down her nose at me as though I were nothing more than a nuisance. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "That's a pretty wild accusation, don't you think?" I could feel my hands clenching into fists, but I wasn't going to back down. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. My horses are dead, Karen. And I know you did it. You've been sabotaging me from the start." Her cold gaze didn't falter. "That's an awful thing to say," she said, her tone almost too calm. "I'm sure you're just upset, but to make such an accusation..." She shook her head, acting like she was genuinely hurt. "I've been nothing but a good neighbor to you, and now you come here and accuse me of murder?" I wanted to scream, but I kept my composure. "I've been watching you," I said, my voice low and steady, "and I know what you've been doing. The damaged fence, the anonymous complaints. You've been trying to force me out from the beginning. But now you've gone too far. You killed my horses." As I spoke, the neighbors started to gather at their windows, curious about the commotion. They could hear us shouting, but they didn't know the whole story. Karen seized the opportunity to play her usual card. She turned toward the gathering crowd, her voice turning sweet as honey. "I'm so sorry you had to hear this," she called out, her eyes welling up with fake tears. "I've tried to be kind, but I guess some people just can't handle a little order. I would never do such a thing. I'm just as shocked as you are, but I know how these things go. Some people want to make a scene rather than follow the rules." The crowd, not knowing the truth, murmured in agreement. Karen had already begun weaving her web of manipulation, casting herself as the victim in all of this. Her perfect act of innocence was so convincing, I could almost see the pity she was receiving in their eyes. She had them all eating out of the palm of her hand, but she didn't realize who she was dealing with. I wasn't just another homeowner. I wasn't some naive person she could push around with her charm. I was a federal wildlife agent, trained to spot lies, to uncover the truth, and to handle things that were far more dangerous than her petty games. She might think she was winning, but she had no idea what was coming for her. And it was only just beginning. I wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. The rage still simmered beneath the surface, but I knew better than to act on impulse. I wasn't just any homeowner. I had resources, knowledge, and access to tools that could bring her down. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about justice. The first step was using everything I had at my disposal as a federal wildlife agent. I had connections in law enforcement, access to forensics teams, and a network of colleagues who could help me quietly begin an investigation. I wasn't going to announce anything yet. I knew Karen had a way of twisting the narrative to her advantage, and I wasn't giving her that chance. I called in a few favors, reaching out to trusted colleagues who knew how to handle situations like this. One of them, a forensic expert in animal injuries, agreed to examine the horses. He was discreet, and I made sure everything was done off the record, at least for now. The preliminary findings were damning. Luna and Diesel hadn't just been killed, they'd been tortured. The injuries on their bodies were consistent with blunt force trauma, likely inflicted by a tool. There was no sign of a predator attack. No scavenger marks. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, and it wasn't just a one-time thing. The horses had suffered before their deaths. With that confirmation, my resolve hardened. I was right. Karen had crossed a line that could never be forgiven, and now I had the evidence to prove it. But I wasn't going to stop there. I needed to understand who she was, how she operated, so I could gather the right evidence to bring her down. I made some calls to trusted colleagues in law enforcement, people who knew how to dig into someone's past without raising suspicion. I didn't want to alert her. I needed to know everything about Karen, her history, her habits, her possible motives. What I uncovered was more than I expected. Karen had a long history of petty revenge, personal vendettas, and manipulative behavior that stretched back years. I'd suspected she was controlling, but I had no idea just how deep it went. It wasn't just about the horses or the neighborhood rules. It was about power, about control. She had a reputation for starting conflicts with neighbors, even going as far as filing false complaints and making up stories to create divisions in the community. There were whispers about her involvement in other petty schemes, forcing people out of their homes for trivial infractions, using her position in the HOA to manipulate people into doing what she wanted. But it wasn't until I dug deeper into her personal life that things started to click. Karen had lost her own family years ago, and ever since, she'd been desperate for a sense of control. She took pleasure in ruining people's lives, in making them feel small and insignificant. And the moment I brought the horses home, I had become her next target. I also found a few troubling connections, old grudges with several other residents who had crossed her in the past. She'd gone to great lengths to ruin their reputations, but in each case the evidence was always circumstantial. Nothing could ever be pinned on her directly, and that's exactly how she liked it. As I pieced together the puzzle, my suspicion grew clearer. This wasn't just an isolated act of cruelty. Karen was building a network of power around her, manipulating the community with a quiet but unrelenting hand. And now she'd taken things too far, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized how dangerous Karen truly was. But that also meant one thing. She had made a huge mistake by underestimating me. As the days passed, the tension didn't ease, it only grew stronger. The more I tried to put things behind me and focus on what needed to be done, the more Karen's shadow loomed over me. It was subtle at first, like the gnawing of rats beneath the floorboards, small signs that something was wrong, but hard to place until you looked closer. One morning, as I made my way out to the backyard to check on my property, I noticed something. The fence surrounding the horse pen was off again. At first glance, it seemed fine, but upon closer inspection, I could tell the wire had been deliberately cut. Not just damaged, but carefully snipped, the frayed edges not from wear, but from something sharp. Someone was getting bolder. Someone was getting close. I crouched down, inspecting the ground beneath the damage. Odd, deliberate footprints, shallow, as though someone had been sneaking around. But they weren't just any footprints. They were too small to be from any of my neighbors, too familiar to be random. Karen was watching me. At this point, I knew it. She was behind it all. This wasn't just about the horses anymore. This was a war, and she was using every underhanded tactic she could to try and force me out. Each time I repaired the damage, she seemed to find a way to come back, to make her presence known. I started receiving anonymous complaints from the HOA. Nothing direct, nothing concrete, but enough to rattle my nerves. Excessive noise, unsightly property, non-compliant with HOA regulations. All small things easily dismissed, but they piled up over time. Karen was orchestrating this campaign against me, using the full weight of her position in the HOA to turn the community against me. She didn't have to do much. She simply whispered into the right ears, planted seeds of doubt, and slowly, the neighborhood began to see me as the problem. I was the troublemaker. I was the one who didn't belong, the one who was too much of a disruption. Every day I walked past neighbors who now gave me sidelong glances, their smiles stiff and forced. They no longer waved at me the way they once had. They kept their distance. Karen wasn't just targeting me anymore. She was targeting my reputation. She was trying to paint me as a troublemaker, an outsider. She was poisoning the well, playing the long game, and if I didn't act fast, I might Lose everything I'd worked so hard for. But here's the thing. I'd spent years honing my ability to read people, to notice the smallest of details, to recognize when something was off. And right now, I was patient, calculating. I wasn't going to fall into her trap. I had access to the best resources, the sharpest minds in law enforcement, and a network of trusted allies who were already gathering the intel I needed. But I wasn't going to rush. I needed her to slip up, to reveal her hand, to expose her weaknesses. I knew she would eventually. She couldn't keep up the facade forever. People like Karen, with their fragile sense of control, always make a mistake when they think they're untouchable. As I continued to gather information, I began to form a plan. It wasn't going to be a wild, emotional retaliation. No, this was going to be precise, surgical. I would turn her own tactics against her, using her manipulation, her control, and her obsession with rules to undo everything she had built. But patience was key. I couldn't afford to make any missteps. Every move had to be calculated. I watched. I waited. I let the tension build, knowing that soon Karen would make the mistake that would bring her down. The sabotage continued. The anonymous complaints mounted. But with every move Karen made, I felt a spark of resolve. I wasn't just going to beat her. I was going to destroy her. And when that moment came, when she finally slipped up, I would be ready. For now, I let her think she was winning. I let her believe she had the upper hand. But deep down, I knew the truth. Karen had just made her first real mistake. I had spent weeks watching Karen, waiting for the right moment. My patience had finally paid off when a crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was going through a few old records of local wildlife incidents when I stumbled upon something unexpected, an investigation into illegal wildlife trafficking in the area. It wasn't just any trafficking, though. It was the type of operation that involved exotic birds, reptiles, and small mammals, species that were protected by federal law. And there, buried within the documents, was Karen's name. It seemed she had been using her position as HOA president to cover up her involvement in a series of illegal deals. She had connections to shady individuals who trafficked in endangered species, and her own property had served as a front for these operations. She thought she had covered her tracks, but I could now see the patterns clearly. The horses had just been the beginning. She was much deeper in the criminal underworld than I'd ever imagined, but it didn't end there. I received an unexpected message from one of Karen's former allies, a disgruntled member of the HOA who had finally had enough of Karen's manipulation. She had seen what Karen was capable of and decided to do the right thing. The tip was crucial. A hidden storage unit just outside town where Karen had been stashing the proceeds of her illegal dealings. Inside it were the very animals she'd been trafficking, some of them even marked with the federal tracking tags I had helped implement. With this information, I knew it was time to act. I'd set the trap. Using my resources and expertise as a federal wildlife agent, I carefully staged the evidence, making sure it was undeniable. I was about to expose Karen for the criminal she truly was, and this time, there would be no way for her to slither away. The day had come. I had the evidence, the undeniable, irrefutable evidence that Karen was a criminal, a manipulator who had been hiding her illegal activities behind the veneer of HOA regulations. It was time to confront her, to expose her for what she truly. As I marched over to her house, not with the same anger that had driven me before, but with a quiet, cold resolve. This time I was in control. I had nothing to fear, and Karen, for the first time in months, was about to realize that her little reign of terror was over. When she opened the door, I didn't give her the chance to speak. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "you've made a lot of mistakes, but the biggest one was underestimating me." Her smug expression faltered for a moment, and I could see the first flicker of fear in her eyes. It was all the confirmation I needed. I stepped inside, pulling out the documents, the photographs, the recordings, everything I had gathered, the storage unit, the trafficking, the illegal wildlife dealings. "I know everything," I said, watching her face turn pale as she pieced worked all together. I have all the proof. I have everything I need to bring you down. You've been running a criminal operation right under the noses of this neighborhood, and now it's over." Karen's facade of composure shattered. She stammered, I don't know what you're talking about. You can't, this is—" "You're done, Karen," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You've been hiding behind your HOA presidency for far too long, and now the law is going to deal with you." Without giving her a chance to respond, I made my way to the front yard. I didn't just have the law on my side. I had the full weight of the federal government behind me. I called in a few trusted colleagues, and soon the neighborhood was watching as law enforcement arrived to investigate her property. The community, who had once been under Karen's spell, began to stir with whispers of her deceit. I stood before the crowd, using my position as a federal wildlife agent to explain what had been going on. The truth was out now. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was a criminal. As the neighbors watched, the weight of her actions finally sank in. She had been the puppet master, pulling the strings of the community, but now she was nothing more than a fallen tyrant. The police arrested her shortly after, and the legal process began. But that was only the beginning. Karen had been publicly humiliated. Her reputation, her status in the HOA, everything she had worked for had crumbled. The neighbors who had once feared her now saw her for what she was, a fraud, a criminal, and a disgrace. She had tried to destroy my life, but in the end, it was her own downfall that would be remembered. And I knew, as I watched her being led away in cuffs, that justice had been served. The victory felt bittersweet. As I watched Karen being escorted away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but reflect on everything I had lost. The horses, the peace of my home, the sense of safety I had once felt in this neighborhood. Luna and Diesel were gone, and no amount of revenge could ever bring them back. But as I stood there, surrounded by the neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak out, I knew one thing. Justice had been served. The truth had come out. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the community was finally free from her manipulation. The people who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly, their respect for me growing as they saw the truth unfold. What had started as a personal vendetta against a woman who had hurt me and my family had turned into something much bigger, a fight for justice, for truth, for the memory of the horses who had suffered at her hands. But even though I had won, the emotional toll lingered. The anger, the grief, the constant pressure, it had all weighed on me more than I had realized. I had spent so many sleepless nights consumed by the need for revenge that I hadn't fully processed the loss. But now, standing there, with Karen's downfall before me, I could finally breathe. There was a cathartic release, a sense of closure. The horse's memory would live on, not just in my heart, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what had happened. They were no longer just victims. They had become symbols of something bigger. I had fought back, and in doing so, I had become stronger. The pain would always be there, but so would the strength I'd gained in standing my ground. I had done what I needed to do, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As I stood there watching the neighborhood settle back into a semblance of peace, I realized that my journey wasn't over. I had avenged Luna and Diesel, and in doing so, I had righted a terrible wrong. But the fight for justice didn't end with Karen's downfall. The world, as I had learned, was full of people like her. Those who would manipulate, control, and destroy to get what they wanted. My work as a federal wildlife agent had always been about protecting animals, but now I knew it was just as much about protecting the peace. I had seen firsthand how power could corrupt, how even in the most serene of places, danger could lurk beneath the surface. But I also understood that it wasn't just about fighting against the obvious threats. It was about maintaining the strength to stand up against the quiet, insidious ones. The ones who used their influence to hurt others, to cause suffering. Those were the battles that truly mattered. As I returned to my work, I knew I had grown. I would continue my mission, protecting wildlife, ensuring the safety of those who couldn't defend themselves, But I would also remain vigilant in my own life. Protecting my peace, my integrity, and the memory of those I had lost was just as important as any law I enforced. In the end, justice had been served, but it wasn't just about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right. Even when the world tries to push you down, there's power in that. And as I've learned, when you fight for the truth, no matter the cost, the world has a way of balancing itself out. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, but you do it anyway.